Hi, I am Austin, and welcome to Animal Quests. Today, we're looking at entitled Karens that messed with the wrong animals. From a package tour traveler who stepped out of a safari vehicle in the KwaZulu-Natal bushveld to close a distance she'd already decided was safe, to a woman who walked out of an Alaskan lodge on the last morning of her holiday to move a bear out of the parking lot herself. But first, in the Southern African Game Reserve, a tourist from Atlanta decided the vehicle protocol didn't apply to her. The morning of July 14, 2018 arrived dry and gold over a Southern African Game Reserve. Winter light in the bushveld sits low and flat across the grassland, stretching shadows long off every acacia and termite mound. And in that light, a hippopotamus at 200 meters on a riverbank looks almost immovable, inert even. That's the problem. The convoy had stopped at a widened gravel turnout overlooking a river bend where a hippo was resting on the far bank in the early morning sun. The field guide, 11 years operating in the reserve, had given the standard briefing before the vehicle stopped. Remain in the vehicle. Do not exit without explicit instruction. Do not make sudden movements or loud sounds. Every adult present acknowledged it. Sandra Hollis, 52, was a package tour traveler from outside Atlanta, Georgia, on her first visit to sub-Saharan Africa. She had opinions about the pace of the tour, the quality of the vehicle seating, and the field guide's communication style, which she had described to other passengers the previous evening as overly technical for what is basically a nature walk. She had a high-end camera with a telephoto lens she did not fully know how to operate, and a settled confidence in her read of large animals that had formed, as best anyone could reconstruct later, somewhere between watching wildlife documentaries on streaming television and a single previous visit to a petting zoo. She called it a fat river horse. That substitution did the same work it always does. It replaced one of the most dangerous animals on the African continent with something she already had a mental category for. Once that swap was in place, the field guide's instructions and the vehicle protocol and the animal's behavior were all filtered through an assessment that had already closed. What I keep coming back to is the camera. She had a telephoto lens that could have given her better images from inside the vehicle than she was ever going to get on foot at that distance. The equipment she used to justify leaving the vehicle was the exact reason she didn't need to. An adult hippopotamus can reach close to 2,000 kilograms and cover ground at 30 kilometers per hour, faster than a human can sprint across broken terrain. The stillness a resting hippo projects on a riverbank does not extend to a person standing in open ground between it and the water. It has not accepted your presence. It has simply not yet decided your presence requires a response. The field guide's vehicle was positioned facing the river, which meant the passenger side doors opened toward open ground. Sandra was seated in the second row on the far side. She exited during a moment when the guide's attention was on the river and on a separate passenger in the front seat who had begun standing for a photograph. The exit was fast. Witnesses said she was moving before anyone registered she had opened the door. She had covered roughly 15 meters into the open ground before the guide saw her. His verbal instruction to stop and return to the vehicle was given immediately, clearly, and at the volume the situation required. She waved him off. Witnesses in the adjacent vehicle described it as the kind of wave you give someone who is being unnecessarily dramatic. The hippo registered her movement at the bank edge and entered the water before cutting across toward the near bank at a pace that closed the distance faster than witnesses expected. On land, it oriented immediately. Hippopotamus threat response does not involve extended display. The head rises, the mouth opens in a wide gape exposing the lower canines. The body squares toward the perceived threat. What follows that orientation is not a further warning. It is the charge itself, a full weight forward commitment that a 2,000 kilogram animal can sustain across open ground with almost no warning interval for someone standing in its path. There was maybe 3 seconds between the hippo orienting and impact. Those accounts always note that it felt longer than it was. They always do. The injuries from the impact and crushing force of the charge were not survivable in the time available before advanced medical evacuation could reach the reserve. She died before the air ambulance reached the landing zone. The field guide's debrief was reviewed by reserve management and the relevant wildlife authority. The vehicle briefing had been thorough and compliant with all operating standards. The positioning of the convoy relative to the animal at the time of the stop was within established safe parameters for in-vehicle observation. The animal had behaved in a manner entirely consistent with documented hippopotamus threat response on land. None of those systems had failed. She had exited the vehicle in a moment of inattention, screened by the vehicle body and the guide's divided attention, waved off the correction, and closed the distance to an animal that reads forward movement on foot as a territorial intrusion and responds to it faster than most people can process what is happening. The visitors who cause the most concern for experienced field guides are never the ones who are nervous. They are the ones who have already decided they understand something they have never actually seen. The hippo had told her what it was in the seconds it gave her. She had decided, somewhere between Atlanta and that riverbank, that she already knew. Sandra Hollis walked 15 meters into open ground to close a distance she had already decided decided was safe. Patricia White closed 2 meters. The distance doesn't determine the outcome. The animal at the end of it does. The afternoon of September 6, 2015, arrived hot and still over the private game concession bordering Kruger's western boundary. The kind of dry season stillness in which the Bushveld goes almost completely quiet between 11 and 3, when most animals have pulled into shade, and the air above the gravel roads shimmers in long, slow pulses. Patricia White, 54, was a retired school administrator from Scottsdale, Arizona, on a 3-night walking safari she had booked after seeing the property in a travel magazine. She had called the concession 3 times before arrival, with questions the booking documentation already answered, submitted a dietary requirements form, 11 lines long for a woman with no diagnosed allergies, and informed the guide during the morning briefing that she had done a great deal of reading about African wildlife and felt she had a strong grasp of the key animals. She had a way of listening to instructions that made it apparent she was waiting for the part where they became relevant to her specifically. The guided walk had been running for just under 2 hours when the group stopped at a cluster of granite outcrops along a dry drainage line. The lead guide, 14 years working the Lowveld on foot, had positioned the group upwind and called a rest break while he glassed the far bank. During that pause, Patricia separated herself from the group by 4 or 5 paces. What had taken her attention was a large specimen laid out along the lower face of the granite in full sun, approximately 3 meters from where the group had stopped. In that posture, in that light, against pale gray and ochre stone, a black mamba at rest reads to an untrained eye as something between a stick and a shadow. Patricia had been doing a great deal of reading. She had, apparently, read enough to recognize what she was looking at. She took 2 steps toward it and crouched for a better look. The guide's instruction was immediate. Stop, do not advance, delivered at the controlled volume the situation required. She looked back at him and said she just wanted to see it properly. That sentence has stayed with me, not because it's unusual, it isn't, that's the problem, but because of how completely it describes what killed her. The black mamba carries a venom that, without prompt anti-venom administration, moves from localized pain through cranial nerve involvement, descending paralysis, and respiratory failure in under 3 hours. It is also the fastest land snake on the continent. Its threat display at close range is unambiguous. The mouth opens, exposing the black buccal lining visible at several meters. The anterior third of the body lifts from the substrate. It is the animal communicating in the clearest physical language available to it that what follows the display is not further display. Every guide working the Lowveld on foot has a specific and personal relationship with that sequence. Patricia was at approximately 2 meters when the animal struck. The strike contacted her lower forearm. She recoiled and the mamba returned to the granite, elevated, watching. The guide had a compression bandage on the limb within seconds, and the evacuation protocol initiated within 4 minutes. The nearest facility with anti-venom stock was 112 kilometers away. Symptom progression began at 18 minutes. Perioral tingling, ptosis, slurring of speech. By 31 minutes, she could not sit unassisted. The helicopter reached the landing zone at 47 minutes. She was non-responsive during loading and died en route. The concession's incident review confirmed the guide's conduct had been exemplary throughout. The briefing had been thorough, specific, and compliant with all professional guiding standards. The evacuation had been initiated correctly and without delay. None of those systems had failed. She had separated from the group in a moment of inattention, closed distance on an animal that had already signaled its position clearly, waved off the correction, and taken a strike that the evacuation timeline could not overcome. The mamba vacated the outcrop within minutes of the group withdrawing, moving into the drainage vegetation without further contact with anyone present. It had delivered a single strike at the moment the distance became untenable and returned to thermoregulating on warm granite in the afternoon sun. The guide told me that in 14 years he had never had a guest struck on a walk. He said the briefing that morning had been the most detailed he gives, that the granite outcrops on that drainage line are exactly the kind of spot he describes when he talks about mamba thermoregulation behavior, and that he had said so specifically that morning to the group. He said she had nodded. He said they always nod. Patricia White had the information. She had sat through the briefing, heard the specific warning, and walked toward the animal anyway. Ryan Beckett didn't ignore the warning. He just decided the situation didn't need one anymore because someone else was already handling it. That turned out to matter less than he thought. The morning of July 18th, 2017 arrived humid and bright over the coastal cliffs of southern Bali. By mid-morning, the heat had already settled into the stone paths of the temple complex that runs along the cliff edge, the kind of accumulated warmth that comes off ancient paving in the tropics, rising from below as much as from above. Ray Beckett, 27, was a travel content creator from London, 6 weeks into a Southeast Asia trip. She arrived at the temple complex that morning with 2 cameras and a working habit of filming most of what happened to her. The long-tailed macaques that ranged through the temple grounds had been a fixture of the site for years, habituated to human presence in the specific way that comes from proximity without boundaries, neither tame nor avoidant, occupying the same paths as visitors with an indifference most tourists read as docility. Local attendants managed macaque encounters as a routine part of their role. When a juvenile macaque went through Ray's open backpack at a resting point along the cliff edge pathway and made off with a sealed snack container, the attendant's instruction was immediate and clear. Do not chase. Do not cut off the animal's retreat line. Stand back and allow space. Macaques at that site disengaged reliably when not pursued. It was not complicated. It required stillness. Ray reached for her selfie stick instead, and that's the moment, reading back through it. Not the macaque, not the cliff, not the wet stone. That one decision to stop waiting and do something, to treat a situation already being handled as though it needed her to handle it. Most people watching the footage probably thought they'd have done the same thing. That's what makes it hard to look at. Long-tailed macaques are not passive animals. They operate in tight social groups with a well-documented collective defense response. A threat to a juvenile is not registered as an isolated event by the troop. The behavioral trigger is well established. Pursuit, cornering, or closing off an animal's exit route produces an immediate shift from avoidance to aggression, and that response does not come from the juvenile alone. The attendant had managed macaque encounters at that site for years. The instruction he gave Ray was not a precaution. It was the product of watching the same escalation sequence enough times to know exactly where it ended. Ray moved toward the juvenile while shouting, angling to cut it off against the stone retaining wall. 3 adult males dropped from the temple eaves onto the pathway ahead of her, teeth bared, advancing. The pathway, which had been open a moment before, was no longer open. Ray was moving backward. What I keep coming back to is that the attendant was right there, present, correct, already managing it. The knowledge was in the room, and it wasn't enough. There's something specifically difficult about that. The space the macaques needed to disengage was available behind them. Ray retreated along the only line left to her, backward along the cliff edge pathway, between the inner temple wall and a low outer retaining edge above a rock drop. The stone was worn smooth by years of foot traffic and wet from morning humidity. She was moving fast, moving backward, with the outer edge somewhere behind her in a direction she was not watching. She lost her footing on the worn stone and went over the outer retaining edge. The drop onto the rocks below was not survivable. She was confirmed dead before rescue personnel reached her position. A recording device believed to be one of her cameras was recovered from the pathway. The footage was fragmentary. The angle captured part of the pathway, but not the retaining edge section, and confirmed what witnesses had already established. Local authorities reviewed the incident fully. Attendant conduct was confirmed appropriate throughout. No changes to site management protocols were recommended. The last line of the attendant's account noted that the macaques retreated within moments of the pathway clearing, moving back into the temple eaves without further contact with anyone present. They didn't want a confrontation. They were never going to want one. They just needed the exit Ray had closed to be open again. That's not a complicated thing to understand. It's just a sad one. Ray Beckett walked into something because she couldn't stay still. Claire Stevens walked into something, got the answer back, and walked in again. There is a version of this that is harder to explain than ignorance. That version is what the next case is. The afternoon of September 9th, 2014 came in hot and still over the narrow gravel roads of a major southern African national park. Late afternoon in the bush at this time of year carries a heavy, pressing quality, the air thick with heat that the shade barely cuts. The light turned amber and angled low over the scrub vegetation. Safari traffic on the internal road network moved slowly in the hour before dusk, vehicles queuing behind whatever the bush placed in the road. On this afternoon, what had been placed in the road was a bull elephant in must, a large adult male that had stopped along a narrow section of gravel and was holding position, blocking vehicle movement in both directions. Claire Stevens, 51, was a tourist from the United Kingdom, traveling independently through the park in a rented SUV. She had been stationary in the queue for several minutes when she exited the vehicle. Other drivers in nearby vehicles had communicated through open windows that she should stay inside. Claire had heard those communications and stepped out anyway, moving to the front of her SUV and beginning to shout and wave in the direction of the elephant, attempting to drive it off the road. The correct response to a musk bull on a safari road has been documented and communicated by decades of protocol. It is to stay in the vehicle and wait. Claire had been given that information, had heard it from the drivers around her, and had decided her approach was better. She was wrong in the specific way that doesn't offer a second attempt. A bull elephant in must is physiologically distinct from the same animal outside of that state. Must is a periodic condition in adult male elephants involving a significant hormonal surge that elevates aggression and dominance behavior to a sustained peak. The external indicators are visible and consistent. Temporal gland secretion running in a dark line down the face, continuous urine dribbling, the head carried high, the ears spread wide. This animal was displaying all of them. The behavioral profile of a must bull in response to a perceived challenge from a human on foot at close close range does not include an extended warning phase. It escalates from display into committed charge when the challenge is maintained. A bull in full must display on a narrow road is not a traffic inconvenience that has wandered into the wrong place. It is an animal already engaged in a dominant situation. Every noise Claire made from in front of her SUV was a response to that engagement, not an interruption of it. The elephant produced a mock advance, a short forward movement with the head raised and ears spread. Claire retreated several steps toward the vehicle and then moved forward again, continuing to shout. That second advance is where this case turns. The mock charge was the answer to the question she was asking. She asked it again, from closer range. The answer that followed was not a mock charge. The elephant transitioned into a full committed charge at close range. At the distance, Claire had closed too, several steps in front of her own vehicle. There was no door to reach, no structure to put between herself and the animal. She did not make it back to the SUV. The crushing injuries sustained in the open were fatal. She died before other vehicles could organize any meaningful response. Park authorities reviewed the incident. No findings were made against other drivers or tour operations. Claire had exited a stationary vehicle on foot in the direct path of a musk bull, sustained a mock charge, and advanced again. Every other driver in that queue knew the elephant would move on its own timeline and was waiting for it. That wait would have ended without incident. Claire decided it was a problem she could solve on foot by shouting. The road was exactly as long after the charge as it was before she got out of the car. Only the options had changed. The mock charge was the moment. Everything before it was noise. Everything after it was consequence. From an open road to an open dock, the next case didn't involve a predator in the conventional sense. It involved a marine animal that most people walk past without a second thought, a wet surface, and a gap in the dock that nobody was supposed to be close enough to fall into. The morning of May 26, 2018, arrived gray and cool along the central coast. The marine layer that settles over the Monterey shoreline in late spring produces a flat, diffused light that sits over the water and dockside infrastructure without lifting until mid-morning. Along the marina, the California sea lions that hauled out regularly on the lower dock platforms were in place as they were most mornings. Large animals, some exceeding 600 pounds, occupying the dock surface in the specific way that makes the marina both a visitor attraction and a managed safety situation. Harbor staff treated it as both, every day, without exception. Jenna Morales, 34, was a tourist visiting the marina as part of a day trip along the coast. She had already been redirected once that morning. Staff had corrected her approach to one of the hauled out animals in front of other visitors. She had complied. Based on what followed, she had interpreted the correction as a social performance rather than a genuine safety instruction, a distinction that produced a very different behavioral conclusion about what to do when the audience changed. A person who reads a safety warning as a performance for bystanders will modify their behavior while they're being watched and revert when they aren't. That's not defiance. It's a misclassification of what the warning actually was, and it tends to resolve the moment they're alone with the thing they were warned about. She walked toward a large male sea lion resting near the dock edge while recording on her phone. When the animal did not move in response to her proximity, she pushed it lightly with her foot. She read the stillness as permission to escalate. It wasn't. It was a resting state with a fully intact defensive response. Those are not the same condition, and the difference between them resolved the moment she made contact. California sea lions are not domesticated animals and do not respond to sudden physical contact from strangers with passivity. A large male at rest on a dock surface is an animal whose defensive bite response is immediate, full force, and not preceded by a warning sequence designed for a human observer to interpret and act on. The bite to Jenna's lower leg was immediate. The animal retreated toward the water after making contact. Jenna stumbled backward in response to the bite and the animal's sudden movement. The dock surface in the hauling area carries a biological film, algae and moisture that accumulates in the tidal zone and reduces grip under any uncontrolled shift of weight. She lost her footing and fell between the dock pilings into the tidal gap below. The no-approach rule was doing two jobs at once, keeping people away from the animals and away from that dock surface. She had already walked past both of them before she ever reached the animal. The tidal gap in that section of the marina was narrow, and the current within it was active. The water temperature in late May along that stretch of coast is cold enough to accelerate the physiological effects of blood loss. The combination of the confined space, the current, the temperature, and the wound to her lower leg made extraction before loss of consciousness impossible for the harbor staff who responded immediately. She drowned before divers recovered her. Harbor staff response and conduct were reviewed and confirmed appropriate. The prior warning had been issued. The no-approach guidelines had been communicated clearly and correctly. No failures were identified in the marina's management of the hauling area or in the emergency response after she fell. Two corrections. The second one she handled by going back when no one was watching, pushing the animal with her foot and falling off a wet dock into a tidal gap. The sea lion was back in the water before she hit it. It wasn't involved in what happened after that. She was. The dock surface, the gap between the pilings, the water temperature, none of those were hidden. The rule that kept her away from the animal was also the rule that kept her away from all of it at once. From a marina dock to a riverbank, same logic, different water. The next person didn't fall in. He was taken. The morning of January 11th, 2016 came in warm and clear over a river crossing in southern Africa, known for its Nile crocodile population. January is the height of summer in that part of the continent. The light sharp and direct from early morning, the vegetation along the banks dense and green from the seasonal rains, the water brown and opaque in the way that conceals everything below the surface from an observer standing at the edge. The designated viewing area sat above the bank at a safe elevation with a clear sightline over the water. The bank directly below was marked with warning signage at every point of approach, not arbitrarily, but because people kept descending anyway, and the signs were the last option available short of a physical barrier. Eva Pike, 38, was a tourist from Australia, traveling independently through the region without a guide. She was not part of an organized tour and had no professional wildlife background. She spotted a large Nile crocodile resting in the shallow vegetation near the muddy shoreline from the elevated viewing area and made the decision to descend to the bank for a closer photograph. Other visitors noted that she passed multiple warning signs on the way down without stopping, and that several people nearby made comments about the distance she was closing. She acknowledged those comments without altering her approach. She wasn't unaware of what people were telling her. She had simply reached a conclusion that made their concern irrelevant to her plan. That's a specific kind of dangerous, not ignorance, but certainty. Nile crocodiles at rest near a muddy riverbank are not inactive in any meaningful sense. The stillness that an observer reads as passivity is an ambush posture, a behavioral state in which the animal conserves energy and minimizes surface disturbance while maintaining full sensory awareness of everything around it. A large Nile crocodile is capable of launching from that posture in a single explosive movement that closes the gap between concealment and contact faster than the human visual system can register the initiation of the strike. The bank vegetation and the slope of the shoreline at that section meant that Eva was reducing her distance toward the animal without a clear view of where the mud ended and the water began below the roots at the edge. The crocodile was not asleep. It was not indifferent. It had been tracking the bank above it from the moment Eva started descending. What looked like stillness from where she was standing was, from the animal's position, active and continuous assessment. Every step she took down that bank was a data point. By the time she crouched at the waterline, the data had resolved. When Eva crouched at the water's edge to get a lower camera angle, a position that brought her within a few meters of where the animal had been holding in the shallows, the crocodile launched from the water and seized her by the upper body before pulling her below the surface. Witnesses at the elevated viewing area saw the water change at the bank and raised the alarm immediately. Rangers organized a search that afternoon. Eva did not resurface. Partial remains were recovered downstream 2 days later at a location consistent with the river's movement in the hours following the attack. The investigation confirmed that the designated viewing area had been correctly positioned and that the warning signage on the bank approach had been present and legible at every point of descent. No failures were identified in the site's management. Eva had descended past every marker placed between the viewing area and the waterline. She went down because the photograph from the elevated area wasn't close enough. The elevated area existed specifically because of what lived in the water below it. The photograph she was trying to take was the reason the signs were there in the first place. She read them on the way down and kept going. The crocodile had been waiting at the bottom of that logic the entire time. The last case didn't happen at a wildlife site or a safari property or a riverbank. It happened in a parking lot on the final morning of a holiday, while an animal that was already leaving was given a reason to stop. The morning of October 2nd, 2014 arrived cold and still over interior Alaska. Early October in that part of the state brings the first serious cold of the season. The air sharp enough to see your breath from the moment you step outside, the ground frost hard underfoot, the sky pale and clear all the way to the horizon. At a lodge facility near a park visitor area, the morning departure routine had been interrupted before the first vehicles pulled out. A subadult brown bear had entered the parking area overnight, drawn by a refuse container that had not been properly secured, and was still present when guests began moving toward their vehicles. Staff had closed the lot exit and directed guests to remain inside the buildings until the animal moved off on its own timeline. It was a routine situation with a routine resolution. It required only that guests wait. Sandra Holloway, 58, was a tourist from the Midwest on the final morning of a week-long trip. She was not a wildlife professional and had no formal training in large mammal behavior. She communicated her disagreement with the delay to staff before walking out of the lodge and into the lot. The instruction had been explicit. She had heard it, weighed it against her departure schedule, and proceeded. I want to be careful here, because I think it's easy to describe what Sandra did as arrogance and miss what was actually happening. She wasn't wasn't dismissing the bear, she was solving a logistics problem. The bear was in the way of her schedule and she was going to go move it. That's not wildlife arrogance. That's normal problem-solving logic applied to a situation where that logic simply doesn't work. Brown bears in interior Alaska in early October are in the final weeks of hyperphagia, the pre-denning period in which caloric intake drives almost every behavioral decision the animal makes. A subadult in that state is not an aggressive animal by default, but it is a focused one, operating at a threshold of tolerance that does not resemble its summer behavior. More importantly, a bear that has already entered a human use area and located a food source has compressed its flight distance significantly. It has determined that proximity to the structure is worth the discomfort of being near people. A person advancing on it directly and vocally is not triggering the same response it would in open terrain. Witnesses reported Sandra advancing on the bear while clapping and shouting, a dispersal technique that carries some validity in certain bear encounter contexts and none at all in this one. The bear was a subadult male, approximately 200 kilograms, and it had not moved off at the sound of the lodge doors or the voices of staff at the building entrance. It was not a bear that was going to be clapped away from a food site by a single person crossing a parking lot toward it. What I keep coming back to is that the staff were watching this happen from the doorway and could not reach her in time. They knew exactly what the bear's presence in that lot meant. They had said so, clearly, before she walked out. The information was current, it was correct, and it was ignored. The bear's response to Sandra's approach was not immediate. It held its position at the refuse container, oriented toward her, head low. That posture, the low head, the direct orientation, the stillness, is not curiosity. It is the animal's threat assessment resolving. Sandra continued to advance. At approximately 6 meters, the bear charged. It was not a bluff. A brown bear charge at that distance in an enclosed space does not allow for the reaction time the word charge implies. She was struck before she had completed a backward step. The injuries sustained were not compatible with survival. She died before medical evacuation reached the facility. The investigation confirmed that staff conduct had been correct throughout. The temporary closure had been appropriate, the instructions clear, and the emergency response once Sandra was down had been immediate. The bear's behavior was consistent with documented response in a food-conditioned subadult at close approach in an enclosed area. The bear was located and destroyed in the days following the incident per Alaska Department of Fish and Game protocol, the standard outcome when a food-conditioned animal makes lethal contact with a person in a managed facility area. The animals would have moved on. They always do. The whole cost of the situation was the wait, a finite, manageable, temporary wait. Sandra decided that wasn't acceptable, walked into the lot, and turned a delay into something that couldn't be undone. She was on the last morning of a week-long trip. The car was right there. The exit would have opened. All of it was minutes away from resolving on its own.